Good evening there, everybody. What is happening? Hopefully, y'all are having a wonderful day today. So, when it comes down to it, I thought, of course, that I would give my little fight assertions and my little fight breakdown of the Jaron Boots Ennis as well as the Jesse Bam Bam Rodriguez fight card that ended up happening on the zone. And unfortunately, I haven't really been able to post as much really within the past couple of weeks. I do sincerely apologize for that for a certain amount of the viewers or a certain amount of the people that do watch my channel. More videos, of course, are going to be coming very soon. Unfortunately, there was just certain things that I had to do on certain occasions, especially within really the past month. But anyways, of course, talking about this fight card, this was going to be very particularly interesting because this was going to be a very interesting headliner, both the co-main event and that of the main event. Of course, you had Jaron Boots Ennis with, I believe, being his debut for that of the DAZN card. And of course, you have Mr. Jesse Bam Bam Rodriguez, who I believe has fought there now probably for the past couple of times. I believe that his last fight on there was against Juan Francisco Estrada, of course, the former debatable top 10 pound for pound fighter, where, Jesse Bam Bam Rodriguez, he, I believe, got knocked down once within that fight, but other than that, pretty much took out Juan Francisco Estrada with relative ease. And of course, Jaron Boots Ennis, he's looked at as one of the more top tier talents, of the future as well, but we still don't really know how great he is because he hasn't really faced any elite level of competition. Now, that being said about Jesse Bam Bam Rodriguez, maybe one could possibly state that his level of competition is going to have to improve a little bit as well. But one thing I'll give the kid is this, is that he did defeat at least a decent Juan Francisco Estrada. That was a decent level champion. Now, of course, if you want to state that Juan Francisco Estrada, of course, that he was a little bit older, you can state that all you want to, but he was coming off the win over Roman Chocolatito Gonzalez. Now, in my personal view, I thought that Roman Chocolatito Gonzalez probably pulled out that fight. But I mean, it was a very close and competitive fight, and one could argue could have potentially went either way. And one thing I'll state is this: no fighter that I've ever seen Roman Chocolate, excuse me, that I've seen Juan Francisco Estrada face. No fighter that I've ever seen Juan Francisco Estrada face, whether it be Sarang Bisai or whether it be that of a Roman Chocolatito Gonzalez, no matter what fighter we're talking about, I've never seen a fighter make Juan Francisco Estrada look the way that he looked in the ring overall, no matter what caliber or no matter who is in the ring with him. Once again, whether it be Roman Chocolatito Gonzalez or Sarang Bisai, the Thai fighter that, of course, defeated Roman Chocolatito Gonzalez, or whoever it was in the ring with Juan Francisco Estrada. I've never seen anyone make him look like that, and that's what the next line of great fighters usually can do to the former great fighters. We've seen it time and time again. We've seen it with Oscar De La Hoya and Chavez Sr. We've seen it with Tyson Fury and Vladimir Klitschko. We've seen it overall with a certain amount of other fighters, of course, that would be next in line for the potential number one pound for pound spot. So when it came down to it, it didn't really surprise me with Jesse Bam Bam Rodriguez's great performance, but we're going to talk about that as the video goes along. As for Mr. Jaron Boots Ennis, I think that he is an exceptional talent, but I'm not really quite sure where to rank him at the current moment in time. He definitely can be within my top 10 or top 20 pound for pound because he just doesn't really have enough accomplishments, nor does he have anywhere near the resume. But I am going to be very excited to see both of these fighters a little bit later on down the line. But the main steal of the show that I think that I really have to talk about here, even though this video is mainly talked about in Mr. Jaron Boots Ennis, I think I have to talk mainly about Mr. Jesse Bam Bam Rodriguez because that kid, in my personal view, is an exceptional talent. Not even just a great talent. He is an exceptional talent. And out of all the fighters that could potentially be a threat to, of course, that monster down there, the Japanese monster, Mr. Naoya Inoue, just for a skill for skill. If you're talking about a fighter that could potentially maybe seriously threaten that of a Naoya the Monster Inoue, you're talking about more than likely that of a Jesse Bam Bam Rodriguez. Now, of course, there is Junto Nakatani, who is a relatively skilled and talented fighter and decently athletic, but I don't think that he will have the edge over Inoue. I think that more than likely that his skill set is just not enough. I think that Inoue is more skilled than him, and on top of that, I think that Inoue will have the clear athletic advantage. But of course, that's not to discredit Junto Nakatani whatsoever. He is a relatively talented and skilled fighter and a decent athlete, but I just think that Jesse Bam Bam Rodriguez is on a whole nother level. And of course, I won't forget Bruce Carrington as well. He's not a champion yet, but be on the lookout, for Mr. Bruce Shoo Shoo Carrington because he's a relatively good fighter as well. But let's get into it. We're going to review a video by Mr. AKHi TV because he's going to talk about some things that I thought would be very particularly interesting, not just about Mr. Jaron Ennis, but also the comparison to Terrence Bud Crawford and Floyd Mayweather and a certain amount of other people as well. And within that, I'm also going to talk about Mr. Jesse Bam Bam Rodriguez and compare him to certain fighters that he may remind me of as well. But anyways, let's get straight into it.
Congratulations to Jaron Ennis for winning another decision.
Take a look at overall the landed stats right there. Now, I'm not really quite sure overall. I'm not really quite sure overall how accurate those stats are. And as I've already stated, a certain amount of times in the past, I think that a lot of these fight stats, quote unquote, I think that, they can be highly, non-reliable. But, but if these stats are true, and this tells me overall that the fight, and I did watch a certain amount of it, but I did not watch the whole thing. I think that I missed the last 3 rounds, but from what I was seeing, Jaron Ennis was getting hit way, 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 way too much throughout this fight. Way, 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 way too much. And I've seen that, within Jaron Ennis's career so far, is that he's a very, very talented fighter, but he just stays within the range a little bit too much. I think that he needs to judge distance a little bit better, keep his hands up a little bit more, keep the glove or at least one of his gloves up sometimes when he is throwing the other punch. Sometimes you can tell because he is such a great athletic talent that, he kind of takes advantage of it a little bit. Almost like a Roy Jones Jr. or other certain fighters to where at times, he may get a whopping punch in there trying to get the knockout or at least trying to get a good strong punch in there, and he doesn't keep his other hand up. So you got to be careful with that. Jaron Ennis is going to have to be careful because even though this dude right here, even though he's a relatively good fighter, I don't think that he had anywhere near the athleticism or the power or, on top of that, really the super duper elite level fighting skill in order to actually threaten him. He just didn't have the full package. This guy is a good fighter at best, but he's not really a great fighter.
Against Kareem. This time around, Jaron Ennis looked worse than the last time around. I mean, Jaron Ennis was...
And speaking of Mr. Jesse Bam Bam Rodriguez, let me also give him a certain amount of credit for his defensive ability because pretty much the only time, at least that I've watched Jesse Bam Bam Rodriguez to where I said, okay, his defense looked a little bit leaky or, he could have did a little bit better was when he got a little bit overzealous, I believe, against that of Juan Francisco Estrada and ended up getting knocked down, I believe, with a straight right hand straight to the jaw. At least I believe. I think that was in round 6 of their fight, but I can't remember. But of course, he got a little bit overzealous, and of course, I can't go after him too hard for it because within the next round, I think that he he stopped Juan Francisco Estrada, and he pretty much beat the shit out of that man from pillar to post throughout that whole entire fight. And Juan Francisco Estrada is a very, very tough customer. He's a very tough cookie. But, Jesse Bam Bam Rodriguez pretty much beat that man to an absolute pulp. But the thing that I'm going to give Jesse Bam Bam Rodriguez a lot of credit for, especially with his skill set, is that he is always moving his head off the center line. I really like how he sets up certain punches. He establishes range relatively well, and he always usually is keeping one hand up or keeping a certain amount of his hands up, throughout certain combinations. Or, if he throws the jab or if he throws certain punches on the inside, the other hand is up covering the other part of his face. And that's a very important aspect in boxing. That's something that Jaron Ennis is going to have to learn because, to be quite honest with you, his defense in this fight looked very subpar.
Getting hit too much for me. His defense was non-existent. And the problem is when Jaron Ennis was taking a punch, he will take a clean punch. I'm talking about...
Agreed, and he's going to have to be very careful with that because there's going to be guys that can punch a decent amount harder, more than likely, than what this guy can punch. Now, I can't remember what this guy's knockout ratio is, and I think that this guy, he might have decent shot, but I don't think that he's a guy that that has, Virgil Ortiz type of power. And if Jaron Ennis is going to be fighting someone like that of a Virgil Ortiz or possibly a Terrence Crawford or someone like that, even though I more than likely don't see a Terrence Bud Crawford fight happening, I just think that they're too separated by 2 different generations. if he's going to be facing someone with a decent amount of power, he's definitely going to have to improve the establishing of the distance and of the range. And on top of that, he's really going to have to keep his hands up a little bit more and really try to move his head off the center line. But to be honest with you, Jaron Ennis appears to move his head off the center line relatively well. But he moves it in a way to where it can be easy to time him at times, especially with that lead hand. That's one thing that I noticed within this fight against this Ukrainian. Sometimes he would just get timed a little bit too easily with that lead hand, and that also sometimes can be a problem with staying within the range a little bit too long. So he's going to have to be a little bit careful with that, especially with some of these guys that can punch, because right now, Jaron Ennis, he looks like an elite level talent, but who knows, the man might end up being the next Zab Judah or the next Adrian Broner. For those of you that don't remember, Zab Judah and Adrian Broner at one point in time had top 10 pound for pound, level, hype behind them. In fact, I believe even at one time, Zab Judah was debatably a top 10 pound for pound fighter. I believe after he ended up defeating that one welterweight fighter, Corey Spinks, in order to win, I think, 2 or 3 of the main belts of the welterweight class, for those of you that go back that far. But Zab Judah was always looked at as a guy that was a super duper great athlete. He was a guy that was extraordinarily fast and extraordinarily strong. But he was a guy that just got hit a little bit too often. And as the fight usually went along, his lack of fight IQ usually showed. And of course, he could be broken down as time went along. It was shown, of course, Kostya Tszyu ended up knocking him out very early on. But of course, it was shown against Mayweather. It was shown against Miguel Cotto. It was shown against Joshua Clottey. It pretty much was shown against any A-grade level fighter that Zab Judah would face. And it was very similar with Adrian Broner. Now, in my personal view, I think that Jaron Ennis is more skilled and better than what those fighters are going to be. But he's going to have to really prove it in the ring because, to be quite honest with you, I'm not really quite sure who he can get in the ring against right now. Of course, people are talking about Virgil Ortiz, but Virgil Ortiz, I believe, is at 154 pounds right now. And I'm not quite sure if that fight even is going to come to fruition right now in the first place. And of course, we'll see, who he could potentially fight at welterweight. But to be honest with you, pretty much ever since the Errol Spence and Terrence Bud Crawford unification fight, there's really pretty much no one else there. When you talk about it, I mean, who all really is there? There's Jaron Ennis. I mean, of course, you got that one Staniosis dude, I believe, from Lithuania. Perhaps maybe he could be a little bit of a threat. Maybe Virgil Ortiz if he decides to come back down there. I'm not sure. Maybe Crawford. But really, to be quite honest with you, there's really no one there. I mean, you have Mario Barrios, I believe, who, now is a welterweight champion. But, I mean, come on, who we kidding? So it's like, it is what it is. We'll have to see Jaron Ennis when he finally gets in the ring against someone that, in my view, that can actually truly test him as an all-around fighter.
Jaron Ennis got hit in this fight alone more times cleanly than Floyd Mayweather did his entire career. And that's even a compliment for Jaron, the way he was getting hit against Kareem. I think it's more accurate to say Jaron Ennis got hit in one round more than Floyd Mayweather did his entire career cleanly. Out of nowhere, this fight.
Well, I'm not going to quite say that, but I understand what Mr. AKHi TV is trying to say. Floyd Mayweather Jr., even at his worst, to be quite honest with you, in my personal view, was a decent amount better defensively than what Jaron Ennis was within this fight. His hands are just down way too low. You can tell that he relies a lot on his strength. He relies a lot on his athleticism. And I think that he thought that more than likely that this fight was going to be a little bit easier than what he thought it was going to be. Sometimes this can happen in certain rematches where they think overall the first fight, especially after some time has passed, and some time had passed, I believe, for these two combatants, and I think Jaron Ennis thought that perhaps maybe he was going to get the knockout tonight. And of course, the guy showed a lot of heart. He showed some decent boxing IQ and a lot of grit. And of course, he figured wrong. Of course, for Jesse Bam Bam Rodriguez, he got the early KO. But that being stated, Jesse Bam Bam Rodriguez, in order for him to move on my pound for pound list, he also is going to have to face more elite level competition as well. But Jesse Bam Bam Rodriguez's performance, I think that his performance was a decent amount more impressive, at least in terms of showing his skill set. Now, he also did not face really that great of an opponent, but Jesse Bam Bam Rodriguez, I thought, showed the better boxing ability tonight.
In his last fight, Jaron Ennis abandoned his defense and his jab. He will just walk in as if he's just a brawler instead of a complete fighter. I don't know why Jaron Ennis is fighting this way. I mean, the way he fought tonight.
Well, we'll see. Sometimes certain people overall they fight a certain way because they kind of want to fight that way or they get a little bit overzealous, and sometimes people fight that way because they don't really have another way or because they're a little bit more flawed than what some people predict. That's why I say I believe that Jaron Boots Ennis is going to end up better than a Zab Judah or an Adrian Broner. I think that he has more talent than them. I think that he appears at least at his best to be more skilled than them, but you never know, because at the end of the day, to be honest with you, Jaron Boots Ennis hasn't really been in the ring with someone overall that can truly test him yet. And when Zab Judah and Adrian Broner, they look to have all the athletic talent in the world. People were talking about Broner back then when he was undefeated and a four-way division champion, like he was going to be the next Floyd Mayweather Jr. People forget that there was conversations about Adrian Broner potentially fighting that of a Floyd Mayweather Jr. And then, of course, Marcos Maidana got in there and pretty much fucked his shit up. But, it is what it is. People were talking about him. And, of course, Zab Judah, of course, he was looked to be the next thing at 140 before Kostya Tszyu got to him, and, of course, that ended up happening. But, once again, I predict Jaron Boots Ennis to more than likely have a better career than those guys. But you never personally know. You never know. We'll see.
He was chasing the KO. And the quickest way to get knocked out in the sport is by looking for the KO instead of letting the KO.
I do predict that more than likely that if Jaron Boots Ennis was in the ring against, say, a Virgil Ortiz or against someone that's, in my personal view, was looked at as someone, of course, as more of a big deal or someone that was looked at as more of a threat, I believe that more than likely we would see a better version of Jaron Boots Ennis. But even the best version of Jaron Boots Ennis, when he's a little bit more defensively responsible, he's not really a super duper great defensive level fighter. He's just not. He gets hit a little bit too much.
Will come to you. And that's how Jaron Ennis was fighting tonight. He was chasing the KO, even when it wasn't there. Yeah, he hurt Kareem a couple times badly, but Kareem, he was doing a lot of great things in there. Kareem showed a lot of skill and technique, while Jaron Ennis showed a lot of natural talent, gifted ability. However, he was doing a lot of things without setting up his offense. He wasn't feigning enough, he wasn't jabbing enough, and he wasn't moving his head off the straight line. There was a lot of things.
I agree with Mr. AKHi TV pretty much on every single one of those assertions. Now, Jaron Boots Ennis, in my view, now one of the more recent prospects, of course, that a certain amount of people are also looking at is Mr. Keyshawn Davis, who, of course, had a knockout over that one Latino fighter. Of course, a certain amount of people were impressed because I believe that he gave another great prospect, Richardson Hitchens, I believe is his name, a very tough fight in his last fight, and Keyshawn Davis was able to knock him out within 2 rounds. And Keyshawn Davis, even though, of course, he seems like a relatively talented fighter, I personally believe that Jaron Boots Ennis is more talented than that of a Keyshawn Davis. I actually think that he moves his head off the center line better than what a Keyshawn Davis does, especially when he's throwing that stabbing jab to the body. He throws it off center and, overall he kind of tips it to the side. So that's a very good thing that Jaron Boots Ennis does, at least in my personal view. But he's got to keep his hands up a little bit more. He's got to be very, very careful with that.
Things Jaron Ennis wasn't doing, he just fought like a bull. And it was Kareem who showed a lot of skill. So Jaron Ennis has a lot of things to work on. Starting off with his defense. Kareem, on the other hand, we already knew he was a good fighter. Remember, Boots had already beaten Kareem.
Well, he's good, but he's not great. Now, what I will state is that, you can definitely tell that he's got some boxing ability. He's not a terrible fighter, but he's also not an elite level fighter either. So once again, we'll see what really happens. A fight that I would really be interested in if Jaron Boots Ennis actually wants to fight at the 154-pound weight class. I'd be very interested to see him versus possibly Israel Madrimov.
But Kareem came back and won his way back to being Jaron Ennis mandatory. So he's nothing to play with. Kareem can easily beat a lot of fighters in the welterweight division. However, Jaron Ennis, he showed that he has talent. He showed that he has a chin. Without a doubt, he's a gifted fighter. But he don't fight wisely.
Agreed. And he's got to fight a lot smarter in my personal view, if he is eventually going to be one of the top 10 and top 5 pound for pound fighters later on in the sport, which in my personal view, he has a very high potential of doing because he's a very, very talented fighter. But first of all, we're going to have to see how his resume is going to stack up because, like I said, at the 147-pound weight class, he could even go for complete unification. I don't even know who's all a champion there. I know Jaron Ennis is a champion there. I also know that Mario Barrios is a champion there. I don't even know who else is a champion there, to be quite honest with you, because I really don't even know who the hell else is left in that division. I would have to do some research on it. But we'll see. There are still some talented fighters there. And of course, he could potentially face Virgil Ortiz, maybe a Staniosis or someone else like that. We'll see what ends up happening. But, he's going to have to be careful because he's going to get in the ring with, a guy one of these days that not only is relatively talented and skilled, but on top of that can really, really punch. And if he gets hit with the wrong shot one of these days, of course, he could potentially get knocked out. So let's hope that Jaron Ennis, of course, cleans up the defense a little bit or tightens it up a little bit. Let's see what happens.
According to his gifts, he's not fighting smart inside of that ring. The main difference between Boots and Crawford is their IQ. Crawford IQ is on a whole nother level. Talent-wise, you will think Jaron Ennis and Boots share a lot of similarities, and they do. But when it comes to Crawford IQ and skill set is on another level.
I agree with that. And let me also state this. Terrence Bud Crawford, in my personal view, is not some defensive wizard either. Because other than the Errol Spence Jr. fight, where Errol Spence, to really be quite honest with you, it looked like a lot of his punches were really in slow motion compared to that of Terrence Bud Crawford. And that's not really trying to discredit Terrence Bud Crawford in any way. I just think that Errol Spence Jr., taking a look at it in hindsight, I don't think that he was really the right type of style to beat that of a Terrence Bud Crawford. Because if Errol Spence really was not going to be able to somewhat bully him up against the ropes, I don't think that he really was going to be able to beat Crawford in many other categories. But of course, that being stated, I did predict Errol Spence Jr. to beat Crawford because I did think that the size and the power, and I did think that the chin and possibly even the defense of Errol Spence was going to give Crawford a lot of problems. So I still have to give Terrence Bud Crawford a hell of a lot of credit for the performance that he had over Errol Spence Jr. For sure, no doubt about it. But Terrence Bud Crawford, of course, has a great fight IQ. But that being stated, Crawford has never really been this super duper elite defensive fighter level either. He just isn't. Or, this super great level defensive fighter either. He just never has been. And you can take a look at that in some of his biggest fights. You can take a look at that against Yuriorkis Gamboa. You can take a look at it against Sean Porter. You can take a look at it also even against Israel Madrimov. Terrence Bud Crawford is not someone that is a Floyd Mayweather Jr. in terms of a defensive mastery. He's just not. Now, is he better than Jaron Ennis? Yes, in my personal view, he is. Because one thing I'll at least say about Terrence Bud Crawford is that, whether it be with his head movement or whether it be with his hands up, he at least doesn't get hit that much. Jaron Ennis just got hit way, way, way too many times within this fight.
I mean, Crawford, first of all, has extras, like bonuses. The way he has a killer instinct, he don't even let you hold him. If an opponent tries to survive, Crawford doesn't let them survive. If they hold him, Crawford will...
Well, the thing that Terrence Bud Crawford can do is that he can pretty much do anything in the boxing ring that he really wants to do. I remember the fight against that of a Sean Showtime Porter, when Sean sometimes would try to get shots on the inside against Sean Porter, against Terrence Bud Crawford. And sometimes that works against an opponent. Sean Porter is a type of fighter to where he really likes to roughhouse you. So at times, that certain type of style like that, it can work. But Terrence Bud Crawford, what he really was doing overall, once again, is that he was throwing uppercuts to the body and he was throwing little shots on the inside, even in exchanges, and really bullying Sean Porter, in that of the exchanges and the clinches, to really show Sean Porter that I'm not just going to let you sit here and bully me in the ring. I'm not going to let you do that. And Terrence Bud Crawford did a great job in the later part of the line of that fight, and of course was the first one and the only one, of course, to stop that of a Sean Showtime Porter.
Push them off. Sean Porter tried to survive with Crawford, but couldn't do that the way he did against Errol Spence. Crawford will fight at the right distance, where he can punch and not be held. And that's just extra. The problem with Jaron Ennis tonight is he will go for the KO before his opponent is ready to go.
I also agree with that. Jaron Ennis, I think, once again gets a little bit overzealous and gets a little bit too excited. I also think that there's a possibility that's because, of course, this guy, I believe, survived a decision against Jaron Ennis in the past that he wanted to possibly stop this guy. And I think that it cost him a little bit of extra style points, at least in terms of really sharpening up his performance.
I mean, Boozy Ennis kept telling Jaron Ennis to go finish his opponent since round 3. And I don't think it was time for Jaron Ennis to do that.
Agreed. Because even though there were certain times where this guy was hurt, I don't think that it was the right time to really go for the KO.
They came to fight.
And once again, he's lucky that this dude doesn't have A plus level pop within his punches or A grade level pop within his punches. Otherwise, this could have ended up very, very badly for a Jaron Ennis. And there was a couple of times where Jaron Ennis, he did get caught with certain punches that surprised him a little bit, like that one check left hook that ended up, setting him back a little bit.
However, you got to use your jab. You got to break your opponent down. Kareem, he was just too strong, too technical, and too good to be KO'd. Sometimes you got to break your opponent down and let your KO come to you instead of you going for the KO. And that's the mistake Jaron Ennis made. With that being said, go ahead and drop your thoughts in the comments.
And of course, sometimes you just got to let it come naturally. First, what you have to do in a boxing fight or really in anything before you really go for the kill or before you go for the throat, you got to set him up a little bit. You got to tire him out. And Jaron Ennis was just going for haymakers sometimes, just a little bit too often within this fight. The kid's got to settle down a little bit, I believe, some of those things. But once again, he has a great amount of potential. I think overall that he's a great fighter. But once again, we'll see. We'll see, because once upon a time, many people thought that Adrian Broner and Zab Judah were going to be great fighters. And they were relatively great fighters. But of course, they were proven pretty much to lose pretty much any time they faced true adversity. Is Jaron Ennis going to be one of those guys? I'm going to predict more than likely than not, but we'll see.
In the section below, a fight that makes
so that pretty much is about it for now. And of course, he talked about the potentiality of a Jaron Ennis versus Virgil Ortiz fight, which would be a relatively interesting fight. I just don't see that fight happening at the current moment in time, but we'll see what ends up happening. Could be interesting. And as for Jesse Bam Bam Rodriguez, we'll see who he faces next. Apparently, from what I'm hearing, there's a very big possibility that he might fight that of a Roman Chocolatito Gonzalez next, which would be a very great fight. And eventually, of course, if he is able to defeat Roman Chocolatito Gonzalez, which I predict more than likely that he would because of age and skill set and pretty much everything, around. Of course, if he can defeat Roman Chocolatito Gonzalez and Juan Francisco Estrada, which of course he already did with one of those guys and in dominant fashion, if him and Inoue fight potentially, eventually within the next few years, that fight would be absolutely humongous, because Inoue then would have taken care of certain names like that of a Louis Neri and that of a Steve-On Coolboy Fulton and a Junto Nakatani, if of course he lasts that long, and if Inoue does remain undefeated or still as, mainly that of the elite champion, because you never know. You never know if Inoue possibly could lose to Junto Nakatani, even though I personally would not predict it. Or, of course, if he goes to 126, where he would be clearly outsized and outlengthened by a certain amount of those guys, he, of course, could possibly lose there. So you never personally know. But if that fight does occur between Jesse Bam Bam Rodriguez and Inoue, it's going to be huge, especially if Inoue is able to get that of Junto Nakatani next and is able to defeat him in somewhat of dominant fashion. And of course, if Jesse Bam Bam Rodriguez is able to beat that Roman Chocolatito Gonzalez, because then that will be about the second or third name that Inoue would have wanted within the past, but of course that he could not get within that of the ring, with that of a Juan Francisco Estrada and a Roman Chocolatito Gonzalez. So it would be huge. But anyways, very interesting card that ended up happening today. We'll see what card ends up happening next, but thank you all so much for watching. We'll see what ends up happening. But as for Mr. Jesse Bam Bam Rodriguez, clearly a top 10 level pound for pound talent. I think that he has to be top 10 pound for pound. He's a two-weight division champion. He did defeat Juan Francisco Estrada and Sarang Bisai and Carlos Cuadras all in very dominant fashion. Two of those guys being decent fighters. And of course, Mr. Jaron Ennis, we'll see where he goes from here. I don't think that right now he can be on my top 10 nor my top 20 pound for pound list. Maybe top 20, but that's kind of a stretch just considering his resume. But we'll see what happens. I think that he is severely talented. I think that he's also very, very skilled. I just think that, he has to be less overzealous, and I think overall that he has to tighten some things up. But we'll see what ends up happening. We'll see. But that pretty much is about it for today. Thank you all so much for watching. I'll talk to you all later.